Today, we're diving into a theory that's going to flip what you think you know about aging on its head. We're breaking down a pretty provocative article that says getting older isn't some inevitable process. It's actually being driven by a very surprising culprit. So, get this. What if a hormone we've been told our whole lives is essential, especially for women's health, is actually the very thing that's making us age faster? That is the huge question at the heart of the source material we're digging into today. The article we're looking at puts estrogen directly in the hot seat. It argues that if we really want to understand aging, we first have to unlearn everything we've been taught about this hormone. The author claims the story isn't just missing a few details, it's been told completely backward. To really get our heads around this, we're going to walk through the author's argument piece by piece. First up, we'll look at what they call the estrogen paradox. Then we'll dive into the science of how it supposedly creates stress in our cells. After that, we'll connect that stress to the science of aging, meet the hormone that might be our protector, and finally zoom out to rethink the whole aging process. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the estrogen paradox. How on earth did a hormone that was once scientifically tied to disease get rebranded as this key to female vitality? So right off the bat, the article makes us broaden our definition of estrogen. We're not just talking about the hormone our bodies make. The author uses that term for a whole class of different substances, even industrial chemicals and toxins that can trigger the exact same effects in our cells. This wider definition is absolutely crucial for the whole theory. And this is where we see that paradox play out. The author points out that before 1940, the scientific literature linked estrogen to things like cancer and blood clots. But then there was this massive marketing shift. Drug companies started calling it the female hormone, and an entire industry grew up around the idea that you could reverse aging by replacing it. The article presents this as a huge clash between early science and later business. Okay, so how is this all supposed to work on a cellular level? That brings us to Section 2, the cellular stress signal. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty science behind the author's claims. The central claim is pretty shocking. At a microscopic level, estrogen acts like an oxygen thief. It basically suffocates our cells, hijacking their energy production and creating a state of chronic stress. According to this article, this isn't a small problem. It's a fundamental breakdown of how our cells are meant to work. The article breaks this down into a 4-step chain reaction. First, estrogen supposedly blocks oxygen from getting to the mitochondria, the cell's power plants. This forces the cell to flip on an inefficient emergency backup energy system. But this emergency mode pumps out toxic junk like lactic acid and free radicals. The end result? The cell gets inflamed, it swells up, and eventually, it just breaks down. This quote really captures that idea of a cell in crisis. The author is saying, look, when a cell is spitting out all these toxic signals, it's a huge red flag that it's being starved of the basics, like oxygen. It's a cell that's just trying to survive, not thrive. Okay, so we've seen the theory at the tiny cellular level. But how does that connect to the changes we actually see and feel as we get older? That's what Section 3, Aging's Hidden Driver, is all about. The article draws a direct line from that cellular stress to the classic signs of aging. We're talking about things like fibrotic tissue, that's like hardening collagen that makes you feel stiff, and the loss of muscle mass. It also points to our energy stores getting drained, which can mess with everything from our brain function to our sleep and even suggests a link to states like depression. The author also takes aim at some really common medical ideas. For example, we often hear that nitric oxide is great because it relaxes blood vessels, but this article claims it's actually a toxic free radical. High blood velocity? We think that means good flow, but the author says it could just mean your arteries are stiff and narrow. The main point is always the same. It all leads back to less oxygen getting where it needs to go. So, if estrogen is the villain of the story, does the author give us a hero? Well, yes. And that brings us to Section 4, progesterone, the protector. This slide really lays out a hormonal showdown. On one side, the article paints estrogen as this force that lowers body temperature, cuts off oxygen, and creates inflammation and shock. But on the other side, progesterone is presented as the total opposite. It raises temperature, makes our oxygen use more efficient, and acts as a natural anti-stress hormone that protects the body from breaking down. So the big takeaway here is really all about balance. In this view, progesterone's main job is to act like a shield, defending our body's systems from all that damaging stress that estrogen supposedly causes. All right, our final section. This is where we pull all these ideas together to completely reevaluate what aging even is. Let's get into Section 5, Rethinking the Aging Process. And this is a massive conceptual leap. The author says we need to stop thinking about estrogen as just a hormone and start thinking about estrogenicity as a general state of being. It's the body's default response to all kinds of different stressors, not just the chemical itself. So what kind of things can trigger this estrogenic state? Well, the list is incredibly broad. It includes physical things like radiation and chemical toxins, sure, but also intense psychological stress, a lack of oxygen, and even toxins produced by bacteria in our gut. The claim is that all of these can make our body react in that same stressed out, estrogen-like way. Now, to be crystal clear, the author does not mince words. This quote right here is probably the most inflammatory part of the article. The source directly compares the promotion of estrogen to the historical conspiracy by the tobacco industry. That's incredibly strong language, and it just goes to show how much this theory breaks from the mainstream. And this is the real paradigm shift. Instead of seeing aging as some pre-programmed genetic clock that's just winding down, this theory frames it as the accumulated damage from a lifetime of responding to all these estrogenic stressors. It's not a program, it's the result of wear and tear. So if we follow this line of thinking for a second, what's the bottom line? What are we supposed to do with all this information?
The ultimate implication is actually pretty simple and pretty powerful. If the process is driven by estrogen and these other stressors are what we call aging, then protecting ourselves from those very processes is, in effect, protecting ourselves from aging itself. It shifts the whole thing from something we just have to accept to something we can actively defend against.
And that leaves us with one final massive question to chew on. If aging isn't just a random decline, but a logical, coherent response to a lifetime of stress, what does that mean for how we live our day-to-day lives? It kind of changes how you think about everything, doesn't it? That's the question this article leaves us with.